Welcome back to Let's Talk Politics. We're just 1 week out from Election Day. Can you believe it? Time flies when you're staring down an existential crisis. Over the long weekend, both the Liberals and NDP dropped their fully costed platforms. The Liberals' Canada Strong plan promises nearly $130 billion in new spending, focused on affordability, housing, healthcare, and protecting Canada's economy from tariffs, all with a side of rising federal debt to over $220 billion. The NDP's Made for People, Built for Canada plan also comes with a hefty price tag, estimating that their plan will cost about $227 billion, which would mostly be funded by new taxes on wealth and corporations. And their plan focuses on a range of issues from tax fairness, housing, climate action, and of course, healthcare. And the Conservatives, while still no full platform, instead, they opted to release a video featuring former Prime Minister Stephen Harper that's left some voters asking, where are the details? But don't worry, I've got you covered. My guest today is NDP strategist George Soule, here to unpack what the polls are really saying, why we should be paying close attention to a center-right shift in the Liberal Party, and the dynamics at play for why working-class vote might be drifting toward the Conservatives. And of course, where the NDP fits into all of this. From big wins like dental care to the recent dip in the polls, we're covering the highs, the lows, and everything in between. Quick heads up, this episode was recorded on April 15th, 2025. So while the news may have changed since this conversation was recorded, the thoughts and ideas still remain relevant. So, let's talk politics with George Soule. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Politics. Today, I have George Soule here, NDP strategist, and we're going to be covering everything about the election, what the NDP is doing, and the top political issues from housing, affordability, and, of course, tariffs. How are you doing today, George?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Really excited for this conversation. So I want to obviously dive into the hot topic everyone's talking about, and the big ballot box issue is tariffs. And who's going to be best positioned to stand up to Donald Trump? So when you look at the messaging from the major parties, the narratives seem to be pretty clear. The Conservatives are running with this narrative that Canada's broken and they're the only ones that can fix it. The Liberals are pushing more of a unifying Team Canada message and banking on Mark Carney's track record. And the Bloc, obviously we know, prioritizing Quebec issues and needs. But when it comes to the NDP, what's the story that they're telling? It seems to be a bit lost, and a message that does come to mind is tax billionaires. But is that enough to inspire and mobilize voters?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think some of that framing we've seen because of the tariffs have kind of shifted. I think the Conservatives are trying to hide a little bit from their Canada's broken theme that they've actually been building up for 2 years. And I'm sure as we talk about the election, this will come up again and again. But now there's a sense of patriotism and economic patriotism that I don't think any of us have seen in our generations. And so I think that they're trying to kind of adapt that now. And I think it's an awkward suit for Poilievre to put on. So I think he's challenging, trying to figure that process out. Also, it's just a fact that somewhere between a quarter to a third of his base actually don't disagree with Donald Trump. So he's walking this line. More recently, I mean that by the last couple of days, kind of decided to be a bit more aggressive on Trump just this morning. I think for the first time kind of unequivocally say that Donald Trump needs to be condemned for these tariffs. Anyway, so I think he's shifting. I think that the Liberals, I want to be clear, I don't think that they would wish the tariffs on our country by any means, but I think that they've gotten very lucky in this because every time that Mark Carney gets to go be Prime Minister, that's where he's best, right? So, you've gotten some flack, I think, and rightfully for on Friday pulling that again, but having no announcement, which is weird because it clearly was a tactic, clearly it was a way for him to get away, but they should have put him on a podium to talk a little bit to try to justify the break from the campaign, which is to say the best days of his campaign. And so getting to the NDP, I think we're trying to keep on the same message. I think it's clear that it is a tough road to convince Canadians that Jagmeet Singh is the best prime minister to go against Donald Trump. We've seen that hasn't necessarily worked. Now, I would argue that arguing with Donald Trump about tariffs is kind of like standing on a pier and demanding the waves don't hit you. That all said, so I think where the NDP's sitting, I think it's the best place, I think, where we've always kind of had a role is when this stuff happens, when the chaos hits us, however that is, you want someone who's going to be on your side. So while Mark Carney has spent his time in the private sector, making millionaires and billionaires millions and billions of dollars, and while Pierre Poilievre has spent his entire adult life in the House of Commons voting against workers' rights, we're going to have your back. So we will be there to make sure that the social programs are there when you need them. We're going to make sure EI is stronger. And even if we're not in government, we're going to pressure the government to make sure those services are there, as Jagmeet was able to do in the last couple of years. So I think that's really the message. So sure, tax billionaires is in there, but that's because we want to tax them to pay for the other programs that people need.
Really interesting points there. And as we're talking about the NDP, and you mentioned social net and different security blankets, when we saw back in the pandemic, where a lot of initiatives the NDP pushed for served supports for businesses. But for some reason, this still isn't hitting voters. Like the NDP are still dropping in the polls. They're really struggling, even the possibility of losing official party status. Something clearly isn't clicking with voters. What do you think isn't working? Is it the messaging, the leadership, the strategy, or is it something else entirely different?
Well, so first of all, I'll agree generally that things could be going better, for sure. I mean, I also want to make clear that, people predicted that we might not get party status in Ontario, and we ended up, like in the most recent provincial election, and we ended up still being the official opposition. So one of the things that happens when you are, frankly, as small as the NDP is, and you end up with pockets of support that are hard to see in the national and even regional polling breakdowns. So, for instance, I actually managed the provincial campaign in Oshawa. Now, the NDP got smoked in Durham region, and the Conservatives own just about every riding. But in Oshawa, Jennifer French got almost 46% of the vote. So we generally have really strong constituency MPs. So by and large, those MPs are known in their constituencies. They're liked, they're loved. People know what's there. So I fully admit that nationally things could be going better, but I think we will do better than it seems when you go poll riding by riding, where people will be able to hold on to the riding because the people who have those Democrat MPs know the value of them. Now, nationally, I think there's a couple things here. Maybe the message could have been clearer over the last year or so. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about those things. I think one of the things that's happened is, one, people are terrified of Donald Trump, and two, progressive people are terrified of Pierre Poilievre. And in part by design, even by his own design, he has just been an attack dog through the entire time he was, even with Stephen Harper. And then even in official opposition, he took down the Liberals. He did his job. But then now people are terrified that he's going to cut their programs too. And I think they're right. I think what they're missing, though, is after 10 years of kind of kinder, gentler, more progressive, nice hair, Liberal Party, people forget Paul Martin. I knew to some extent Jacques Chrétien. Paul Martin did some of the deepest cuts this country's ever seen. That's when I came up. That's how I got involved in politics. I came up cutting my teeth in those times. So I am very weary of a right-wing Liberal Party. And I think that is something that I think people haven't necessarily seen yet. So yeah, I think people are gone to the Liberals. I think some of them are going to come back home to the NDP. But a lot of them are sitting with the Liberals because they feel like that's the only way they can stop the Conservatives, even if that's not true in their own local riding.
Yeah, and the big thing that comes to mind is strategic voting, and vote splitting is also a piece. And before I get into that, I totally agree with you. The polls can say one thing, but Ontario election really proved the polls completely wrong. The Liberals being primed for official opposition and dramatically underperformed, their leader not even winning their own seat, which was, to be honest, sad, the fact that you were a mayor of that riding and couldn't even win that seat. But it's really going to be interesting to see how that plays out, and if there's going to be any collaboration similar to maybe the federal level. Actually, I'll ask that question. Do you think there will be any collaboration at Ontario between the NDPs and the Liberals to try and push back on Ford?
I mean, I think the opposition's a bit of a different game. By and large, the opposition parties will push back against the government together, especially with a majority. There's no risk. So you just see them voting against things most of the time, unless it's a really good position. I mean, I would argue that there's probably some space against Trump where all three parties could agree on things. And I think there's probably some good reason for that. But yeah, I think when you're in opposition and there's majority government, the point's sort of moot. I think that had there been a minority, which obviously it wasn't close to, it was a massive majority conservative government. But Had there been a minority, then maybe. But again, the Liberals are a little bit in disarray, so who knows how that would have worked out.
I want to go back to the concern with vote splitting. People tend to flip between the NDP and the Liberals, which can ultimately pave the way for the Conservative win, which is what we saw in Ontario. So my question here is, on a federal level, should the NDP have a moment and say, look, we may not form government this time, but we can still play a powerful role in shaping the outcome? And I'm not talking about forfeiting, but maybe shifting the campaign tone about attacking the Liberals less because, let's be honest, when the NDP or Liberals go after each other, it doesn't seem to land well with voters on either side. But what if the focus was more putting forward a unified Team Canada approach, and one that underscores the importance of voting and clearly laying out that if a Conservative government forms, the very real possibility that the policies the NDP fought for and pushed the Liberals to implement would be rolled back. We're talking about dental care. We're talking about various homeowner supports. There's a magnitude of amazing policies the NDP put forward, anti-scab legislation. Do you think that kind of strategic collaborative messaging is possible or, even realistic right now?
I think it's a heavy question. Do we want to Americanize our system to go down to a two-party system where, if you're familiar more directly with it, there's actually sub-parties within the parties, right? So the Democrats are broken up to, like Bernie Sanders is actually part of a different kind of wing than others are in the Democrats, for instance. I actually think the multi-party system is nice. And in what you've seen in most countries with a system like ours is that coalition governments just become, I'm not advocating for one necessarily, but I'm just saying the coalition governments have become the norm. To some extent, England's had those conversations. All over the places where there is a multi-party system, you see coalition governments are just, Germany, just by default is the system. And people don't balk at that. So what that allows to happen is people can vote for who they want. And then once the election's over, then the government gets figured out, right? Then whoever can kind of compile together the biggest group of people. And I think that system works best because, to be honest, it kind of, as I was saying, I often joke, I'm a Paul Martin New Democrat. And I say I joke, but it's actually serious. When I went out of kind of nonpartisan advocacy and then became a partisan, I knew I wasn't a conservative. And I also quickly learned that I also am not a liberal. I was not part of that. And sure, we've seen Jagmeet kind of do a little bit of the messaging you're talking about. You don't hear him talking about running for prime minister as much. What you talk about is let's get as many New Democrats as possible in the House in order to win. But I think that if you try to break it down, I don't believe that it's clear. I think there's a bunch of people who vote for the Conservatives who sometimes vote Liberal. There's a lot of blue-red, a lot, depending on who the leader is. And I don't think it's an easy transfer of New Democrats all to the Liberals either. Some of us would go Green, some of us would go Conservative, and some of us would feel homeless. And I think there's a conceit, I'm not saying you, but there's conceit to when Liberals say New Democrats just need to lay down their weapons. There are some places where, frankly, it's only New Democrats who be Conservatives, right? There's a lot of blue-orange ridings in British Columbia, parts of Northern Ontario. In lots of this country, Liberals are very different from province to province. In Ontario, it's pretty close to a straight up, they're the same, but that changes. Also, the Liberal Party is a brokerage party. By design, it shifts depending on the leader that's elected, right? New Democrats are always progressive. Conservatives are always on the right wing of the spectrum. Liberals, with Paul Martin, they were kind of a right-wing government. With Justin Trudeau, they're a bit more left of center. I would argue with Mark Carney, they're going to go back to the right again. And they just hoping people don't notice that yet. To answer your question in a shorter way is I think that it works better when we have multiple parties. If that turned into coalition governments long time in the future, I think that we should not be afraid of those. I think that's actually the way systems work the best. You vote where you want, the people you elect go there and kind of form a government, which at its base is actually how our system works. We don't elect prime ministers, you just elect your own MP. So I think that's the best system rather than trying to force people into two parties that they might not actually agree with.
I think there's a lot of really good points there. And I wonder to what extent is this the pressure with the Westminster system? Trudeau and the Liberals also back in 2015 pushed on electoral reform. We never saw that. Do you think if we got that electoral reform, maybe it would have shifted the dynamics of how people voted? Or because I'm also weary of changing our system of voting in the sense of people today who've been in this country for so many years still don't even understand really how to vote. or understand the concept. To your point, we vote for the House of Commons, our local elected representative. We don't vote for a leader like the US. So yeah, I'm just curious on your thoughts on if electoral reform would change our system. It would change our system, but in the sense of voter sentiment and understanding with this multi-party system we have.
Well, there's lots of ways to do it. One, quickly, Justin Trudeau lied. And then even when he did bring it forward to some extent, what he did was ranked ballot system, which means you pick your first preference and then your second and then your third. And then in every place, people get dropped off. And so sometimes the second place person wins depending on how that shift happens, which if you are the leader of the middle party, like on the spectrum, of course, that's what you're going to say, right? As I said the last time, not everybody switches to the Liberals for sure. Some people jump, but by and large, the majority of Conservatives' second choice would be the Liberals. And by and large, not exclusively, the majority of New Democrats' second choice would be Liberals. So, of course, if you are a Liberal, you want the ranked ballot system because that's going to benefit you. So everybody saw that coming. When he proposed that, that wasn't a real proposal. That wasn't an actual attempt at getting change in the electoral reform. That was just Justin Trudeau lying, to be fair and honest. Proportional representation would do what you're talking about, and again, would let people, and there's lots of ways to do it. There are simple ways where you still elect your person. In some ways, just a percentage of vote over across the country. But the problem is that as much as it kind of functionally works as simple at the end, explaining it to people gets hard. A long time ago, and I wish I knew the year off the top of my head, but sometime in the early 2000s, Ontario ran a referendum on mixed member proportional representation. And of course, the referendum failed because we had to tell people, hey, we want to change how we elect people. And here's this long, complicated explanation of how to do it. And so people were like, whatever, please don't bother me with this. Because that system basically says that, one, you still get your local representative. So there's still somebody you can go into and yell at when your roads are bad. And then on top of that, based on the percentage of votes people get, you fill up a section of the chamber with those people. That's probably the easiest and most likely system we'd ever get. But again, trying to explain that to folks who are too busy with their lives, trying to make ends meet to barely vote is a challenge. The one proposal I've heard that might work is if a party ever ran with a real mandate on proportional representation and electoral reform, if you put it through legislation, but said a referendum has to happen in 2 elections, so people would go through 2 cycles of voting this new way, and then say, I like the old way, I want the new way, then at least maybe people could have seen it. Anyway, I think that might be the only way to make it work so that people can actually feel it before they vote on it.
And I think there's such a disconnect when it comes to understanding how to vote and who your elected representatives are. You know, the amount of people, I'm sure both you and I have done a lot of door knocking, had a lot of conversations on doorsteps or over the phone, and explaining how the system works, how you vote. And I guess I want to lean into that point a bit more. Why do you think voter turnout has been on the decline over the years? And we mentioned the Ontario election, less than 50% of people showed up to vote. Very unclear of how many people are going to turn out for the federal election. But why do you think voter turnout has been going down? Do you think it's fatigue with politics, the social media effect? I can't seem to pinpoint it, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts around it.
I don't know. And I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I haven't spent a lot of time studying these things, although I'm obviously interested because, frankly, low voter turnout tends to benefit the Conservatives generally, but even then next to the Liberals, our vote tends to be slower to get out and harder to get out. I think a couple things. Like, one thing that's not talked about enough, I think, is like when we talk about the 50s and when the right especially talks about going back to good old days, and let's not talk about misogyny, sexism, racism, and slavery, and any number of other things that are implied when we do that. But so leaving that all aside, with apologies, but on just the electoral point and the involvement in your local community, taxation was much, much, much higher. We don't talk about that very much, but the days when white picket fence in your home, like people were paying upwards of like 90% on the base level of their income in taxes. And slowly we've eroded that. So people are less and less engaged with their government and more kind of self-sufficient and having to be, right? So that's part of it. Like just having to make ends meet and stuff. It's just harder to feel connected to a government that you send part of your paycheck to, but you just don't really have connection to. I think also the divisions within media, which again has brought a lot of good things, including the fact that you and I get to have this conversation. But for all the flaws of back in the day when you basically either chose to watch CTV, CBC, or Global, basically, right? So there was a time when to get your news, you watched those 3 channels, in Canada anyway, and one of those 3 people, basically middle-aged white dudes, would tell you what was important that day. And so there was a kind of a singular understanding of the news. And so when you sat down with folks, even if people would disagree, you had disagreements, you could kind of have those debates, and then voting became important because you understood what was going on, you thought, and you knew that you had to vote differently than your neighbor because you didn't agree with what your neighbor wanted to have it happen. Or you both agreed, so let's go vote together to make it happen. But now, like with algorithms, people end up in these echo chambers. And so like the paranoia, ego, the arrogance, all those things come out of that. Like if you're a liberal, unless you were trying very hard, all you're going to hear after a very little bit of time are liberal voices. If you're conservative, same thing. If you were part of the trucker convoy or someone who supports the trucker convoy, you do not feel like you are on the extreme. You feel like everyone you talk to and every video you ever see on the internet agrees with you. And in fact, pushes you further, right? So I think those things pull us further and further away from like the central comments. So I think that is part of what's going on. And I think the other thing, frankly, is just when people are struggling with the economy, it's hard to focus on their stuff. Like people are just busy. And like if this wasn't my job, I think it'd be easy to feel like, why bother? Someone else is going to vote.
Very, very powerful stuff. And I totally agree with you. And it's scary how fast the algorithm can push things to you. I find too, like I feel like I'm pretty center with my political views, but the algorithm pushes right-wing stuff to me. I don't know if it's a mixture of because it knows I'm going to be upset and interact with it. I think there's also that disconnect where you're only seeing 7 seconds of something and not understanding the full concept of whatever someone's saying. And I think that's the scary thing when it comes to right-wing or very radical sides is they'll take a sliver of truth about something and then just totally radicalize it, right? And I really appreciate you bringing up the point about media and how we used to consume our news before was very limited with our resources. So I want to ask you about Pierre Poilievre's interaction with media. The Conservatives have been limiting their media access to their leader. Do you think it's helping or hurting him? Because as we can see, he has a track record of being pretty dismissive and sometimes straight up rude to reporters. I can point to that more recent moment in the Soule where he ignored a CTV reporter's question about refusal to get his security clearance and just dismissed her as a protester. Or when he used a very patronizing tone to a female reporter about the crowd size of one of his more recent rallies. That sort of rhetoric is very Trump-like. But yeah, what's your take on how he's handling the media, and is it helping or hurting his image?
Well, so at 30,000 feet, first of all, kind of to the point we were just making together, is that the media plays a smaller and smaller role in how people consume the news. So the mainstream media, or what we consider like newspapers, even TV, radio, in some ways the tariff thing has brought people back to their television sets to try to kind of understand this kind of collective attack we're under. So I think that's interesting. But like even in the work that I do, I started out as a press secretary in 2009. Yeah, I started in February and I got Twitter in October. And the thought of doing the job I do now without social media, like even for me who did it, is kind of unbelievable. And even then, what it was about influencing the media. And now you use the media to help create content for social media. People just collect their news elsewhere. So the first thing I'll say is like how you treat media and how much media like you. You used to say, don't get in a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel, which goes back to the old days, but don't get in a fight with somebody who gets the last word. But the mainstream media doesn't get the last word anymore. I mean, that's changed in the last 10 or 15 years. And more quickly over the last 5. So that's important to understand on that. And then the second part of this is, Jenny Byrne, who's the campaign manager for Pierre Poilievre, has been long open about the fact that she thinks that Erin O'Toole lost that last election because they tried too hard to go for the center. So the calculation that campaign has made is that they want to go after their 30% base plus 10 more. And I actually happen to be on their fundraising list, and they just tell me to go shove it every single email because they've decided that they don't care about the 50% of people who will never vote for them. They want to play in the margins. And so she has decided their campaign strategy which again is what I've seen is kind of the shift because of the way the tariff thing has happened. But their whole thing, this whole campaign for the last 2 years has been run on, we're going to make our base happy. We're going to hang on to those extremes on the right. We're not going to let them slip to the People's Party. And we're just going to make these people really motivated to show up. And they're going to show up and vote, and that's how we're going to win. And so part of that is telling the mainstream media to shove it. It's like their way of kind of telling it to stick it to the man. So does it hurt him? With people who don't agree with him, very much. But I can only not vote for the Conservatives once, right? You can only not vote for the Conservatives once. So people who find that kind of stuff offensive will find him even more offensive, for sure. By and large, his base, especially like the first kind of chunk of it, the first half, they like it. And then they're gambling on the next half are okay with it. To finish this thought is Mark Carney, because of his lack of experience, has also had a challenge with media. He's gotten better at it throughout the campaign. As someone who used to, and still does, coach people for media training, like I can almost see him pause, and I can almost hear the media trainer's voice in his head telling him to take a breath, right? But he also had those challenges. He also was extra condescending to women journalists for a little while. He was also, and he still is sometimes kind of when he gets pushed on things, snide. He said the other day, don't believe everything you read in the Globe and Mail, like to a journalist. Things like that, like don't poke these people in the eye, right? Like shocking, there was an editorial that attacked Mark Carney today in the Globe and Mail. So to my point about not getting in a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel. So none of that would matter to Pierre Poilievre. It matters to Carney because a lot of people who either are liberals or are New Democrats who are going to liberals to fight Poilievre, rightly or wrongly, they are offended by that kind of thing, right? The short answer is, does it hurt Poilievre? No. Does it hurt some politicians? Yes. And I think that's the difference, is who your audience is. Now, I also think it's toxic and a problem that we have a major political party that is fertilizing and encouraging a group of people who are trending further and further away from our society and pushing back harder and harder on societal norms and things that help us work together. But that's why I'm a Democrat, right? So, I mean, hopefully we can pull that back. But yeah, I think that it's far from hurting Poilievre, I think it's part of the strategy.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's part of the strategy, which makes me completely weary and very distrustful. And I speak with a lot of women, I would say, between the age of 18 to 35, really do not trust him. But going back to the point of it's intentional and you don't think it's hurting him because he's speaking to that voter base, I want to go back to, let's say, January earlier this year. The Conservatives were at a huge lead. And that has since obviously dropped dramatically. I think it was a 20-point lead they had at one point. The Liberals, once they introduced Carney, this has dramatically shifted. How much do you think of that voter base, with the polls tightening, again, taking the polls with a pinch of salt, it had to do with the, I don't want to vote for Trudeau. And they just thought, let me go to the Conservatives. What are your thoughts around that, the fact that it dropped so quickly? And do you think there's that Trudeau element to it? That being said, why do you not think more people went towards the New Democrats with this shift in leadership?
Yeah, a bunch of things there. And actually, one of the things I meant to mention earlier that I'll add is I want to be clear that I think polls are accurate for what they are. I don't think it's the pollsters that are wrong. I think it's the people who interpret them that do a disservice. So I think the polls are accurate for the regions they're looking at, right? So like, as I said about Oshawa, I think it was true to say that in Durham, the Conservatives are winning. I just think when people try to break that down into little pieces, that's where the problem's at. It's like weather people. Like meteorologists, apparently, are actually almost always right. It's just that the region they look at is so big that somewhere in that area, it rains when they say it's going to rain. Just because you and I only see sun, and we say, oh, the weather guy got it wrong again. Anyway, I digress a bit, but I think that's important because when the Conservatives say they don't trust the polls, that is very different than us saying we're optimistic about what we can do inside like a few different ridings. On your question, what happened? I mean, yeah, we've seen some memes about it, but I actually think it's partly true. Like some people's entire identity became hating Justin Trudeau. I've done some work and a special place in my heart is in Saskatchewan. And like Justin Trudeau brought Jagmeet's numbers down. Jagmeet was polling above Justin Trudeau in Saskatchewan until the agreement. Then Jagmeet's numbers went down. The Saskatchewan party, like their entire campaign against the Saskatchewan NDP was that Carl Lebec was Justin Trudeau's choice for Saskatchewan. Obviously not true, but that was their whole hook. How do you hurt a New Democrat? Call them a liberal, right? And say that Justin Trudeau likes them. So that really was a whole part of their campaign. So I think that's part of the shift was that. I mean, also people want change. And so often when you change leadership, you can pull it off. Now it's a bit quick. but they've been able to do it. I think there were a lot of people that went to Poilievre begrudgingly, and they weren't really with Poilievre. They just weren't with Trudeau. And so there were a bunch of Liberals, and that's like before our numbers really fell through the floor. I think there were a bunch of Liberals just hiding kind of with the Conservatives, and they weren't never going to vote for that guy. But they also just were tired of what the Liberal government was doing. So Carney comes in, great, new person that can run away. I don't have to hang out with this kind of creepy dude who's angry all the time. And so I think a lot of that happened, especially with women, but also with men. And so why has the shift not happened? I think the other thing that happened was the tariffs and Donald Trump. And again, there's just this weird's probably the wrong word because I don't want to diminish it, but there's kind of this consensus that's been created that like Mark Carney's the person that can manage Trump. Again, I either dispute Mark Carney's, especially his public service experience, and even his private service stuff. Like I have a problem with it because I think a lot of what he did are things that he should now be condemning as prime minister. Totally fine when you're in the private sector, but he should be coming out and saying, you know how much money I made using tax havens? Like I made a lot of money on using tax havens. When I'm prime minister, I'm going to get rid of those. And instead, he just says, this is how the game works. It's fine. So anyway, I have problems with that. But the point is, I think he's got a good resume. If this was a reasonable president, I would say, sure, he's a guy to negotiate with him. But again, I don't think negotiating matters with Donald Trump. But yeah, there's been this consensus that he's the solution. So that's why kind of people have gone around it. And again, to repeat myself, but people are, especially real progressives, are really concerned both with Donald Trump and Poilievre. And one of the problems with so-called strategic voting is that it isn't strategic. And so it misses riding by riding. And even some of these websites, like there are some websites that have literally the New Democrats ahead, Liberals are behind, the Conservatives are like 15 points back, and it still says your strategic vote should go to the Liberals. It's like, well, what? Like the Conservatives are going to win. Let one of these two teams, it doesn't matter. So, yeah, I think people see the big polls and they think I need to stop Pierre Poilievre, so I'm going to vote for the Liberals. Now, again, there's lots of places where voting for the Liberals is how the Conservatives win. So I think that's one of the challenges, but I think that's what's happening. People are just afraid of Trump. They're afraid of Poilievre, so they've gone to Carney, and that's, we'll see over the next 2 weeks how much that can shift. And that's why you really see me talking so much about, fine, you want Mark Carney to be prime minister? It looks like the majority of people, that's what's going to happen. Let's get an opposition in there that'll actually hold his feet to the fire. He's going to balance the budget in 3 years. That is going to involve a lot of cuts. So let's put us in there and we'll make sure the cuts don't happen.
That's a wrap on today's conversation with NDP strategist George Soule. But we're just getting started. George will be back in our next episode as we keep breaking down the election landscape. We'll get into the differences between provincial and federal NDPs, take a closer look to why Pierre Poilievre's boots not suits slogan doesn't quite hold up for a guy who spent his entire career in tailored suits, and best of all, George shares what it was really like working with the legendary Jack Layton. Oh, and yes, somehow Rubber Chicken makes an appearance in our next conversation, but you'll have to tune back in if you want to hear that story. Catch you next time on Let's Talk Politics.